Hello, I am Cody Ellingham, and this is the Transformation of Value podcast. This show is brought to you by Swarbricks, the first law firm in New Zealand to accept Bitcoin for legal services. The team at Swarbricks are Bitcoiners, and they are knowledgeable about the legal aspects of Bitcoin in New Zealand in areas like estate planning, property, and trusts. Swarbricks offers a 20% discount for services paid in Bitcoin. Find out more at swarbricks.co.nz/Bitcoin. Now, in today's episode, I talk with Kevin Whitmore from Callaghan Innovation. Callaghan are a New Zealand state entity providing research and development assistance and funding to help Kiwi businesses grow. We talk about Kevin's background and his journey of understanding Bitcoin and what money is, as well as his current role looking at Web3. For Kevin, Web3 is focused broadly on decentralised internet tech, and we discuss payment innovations with the Lightning Network, Bitcoin, Nostr, and more. I am encouraged to see an interest in Bitcoin technology from the New Zealand government. I welcome Callaghan's approach of objectively looking at everything that comes their way and making judgments based on first principles. Ultimately, having a vehicle like Kevin's work at Callaghan Innovation could be one of the ways New Zealand becomes a first mover in adopting Bitcoin. I am even quietly encouraged to see the label Web3 reclaimed by genuinely decentralised tech, such as Nostr, Lightning Zaps, and Fedi. I do hope you enjoy this episode. If you want to get in touch with me, please send an email to hello@thetransformationofvalue.com and I will get back to you. Otherwise, on to the show. Kevin, welcome.
Thank you.
What a day it's been. We've just been talking about a few things that are happening more broadly in New Zealand, but I appreciate you making the time to come down to the studio. I first met you at BitKiwi a couple of weeks back. I think before then we had just interfaced over LinkedIn and some of the Web3 work that you're doing.
Yep.
I'm just keen to sort of understand a little bit, kind of zooming out. How did you get here? What's your Bitcoin story? How did we end up meeting at BitKiwi?
Yeah, well, I guess my first experience with it was actually a bit of a joke. It was a bit of a prank. I had a friend who did a 3-month nano degree at the University of Cyprus on digital assets, and we just thought, what on earth is this? This was back in 2014, I think it was. And so by 2015, everything he was talking about had kind of dipped off and crashed, so we thought it would be a bit of a laugh if we got involved. Mostly just to, I guess have a bit of a laugh more than anything else. So that was 2015. Along came 2017. Things started to ramp up again. And that's when I sort of went down the rabbit hole and went, not only is, not just what are these things, but how does money work? What happened in 1971? All those sort of, I guess the background to what makes up hard money. So that was my orange pilling moment, I guess.
Yeah.
And people ask, why, what is it about Bitcoin? And it actually wasn't Bitcoin. It was learning about all the other traits of money that led me to understand and go down this path, I guess.
You were working in fintech though once upon a time. So I'm interested because you also talk about your time studying Japanese of all things, which is something close to my heart. So how does that all work together, your time in Singapore, your fintech background, and Japanese?
Yeah, so I was 10 years in Asia, 5 years in Japan, 5 years in Singapore, and got the opportunity to run a fintech business in Singapore, which was doing expense management for banks. So that was unreal. It was, very much 10xing everything else that I'd done in terms of exposure to new things. That was a fintech business. So we had, consulting, managed service, software development, and that was Singapore for us. And just exposure to the banking circles, I guess, also helped with, the monetary aspects of understanding and learning about some of these things and being close to, I guess, the traditional finance side of things. Really shone a light on what it meant to this new world of digital assets.
Yeah, wow. And you said 5 years in Japan. Was that Tokyo or you were in somewhere else?
It was 1 year on the JET program, so it was Wajima.
Oh, nice.
a fishing village of 28,000 people.
Kind of the exact opposite of Tokyo.
The exact opposite of Tokyo. No trains. They were ripping up the railways when I was there, which is very much antithetical to Japan, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, just very much immersed. Local culture, local everything.
I'm just curious. So, as Japanese at Canterbury, that wasn't Edwina Palmer, was your?
Yep.
Yeah, I know.
Yep.
She was. She taught me as well. So that's interesting. A small world. And it's interesting though, talking about Japan. So often the first thing that really blows people away is just how backwards some of the stuff like banking is. You know, like still use the little books for printing out your balances, and kind of the dichotomy of this kind of high-tech image and then the actual low-tech legacy banking system. Singapore's a little bit different, a little bit more agile, but overall, did you have any insight from the way the Japanese were looking at the banking system, their approach to fintech?
Yeah, I guess, seeing ATMs close on weekends and after certain, it was that sort of stuff. And they're very much a hands-on physical, I think, even from an investment perspective. Gold is heavily featured over there. So yeah, I mean, that's the Japan way of things, but also very different countryside versus in the cities, right? In terms of their exposure, they're still very high credit card users throughout the country. But yeah, typically in countryside, you'll see more remote areas, you'll see more cash usage versus other things.
Cash is huge in Japan. And I mean, certainly when I went back in May, I noticed though that perhaps in tandem with the Olympics they had recently, things have changed a lot. Like it's become a lot easier to operate as a visitor. Things like credit card acceptance, withdrawing funds into local currency. It's certainly improved, but still on the ground there are challenges. But you had this background working Singapore in the heart of fintech, and then what brought you to Callaghan?
Yeah, so I did obviously the fintech thing. Prior to that, I was also in IT and sort of had quite a traditional background before I became an entrepreneur. So unfortunately I still have Lehman Brothers to my name as well as one year there. So I got quite a bit of exposure to the good and the bad side, I guess you'd say, of the banking and the financial services, which has also kind of inspired me in this space as well around what we're seeing in terms of these new movements, etc. So the Callaghan side of things, I guess it was an opportunity for the first few years that I've been with Callaghan Innovation. We've mostly been concentrating on SaaS companies, so pure digital businesses, but not so much on emerging software side. So blockchain, anything related to sort of that Web3 sphere, we've only really been involved with it heavily in the last 18 months or so. But yeah, we've been sort of assessing project grants and things that have coming through to us in terms of new innovation since 2017, 2018. But yeah, what drew me to it was just the opportunity to work with some smart people in a sphere that I can give back and help other businesses. It's my time to kind of switch off as an entrepreneur and help other entrepreneurs and founders with their businesses, etc.
Yeah, well, I can certainly attest more broadly to the impact that Callaghan Innovation has just across its portfolio. I guess with some of my other work, Callaghan's been very valuable in terms of stewardship, some of the grants and things to enable work and research and development in particular. It's certainly, I think, an asset for New Zealand to have that sort of organisation. Looking at what it means for money, though, obviously you're talking about SaaS products here, but I mean, fundamentally, Bitcoin represents a challenge to the status quo of money and the way we think about money. How do you see that interfacing with the likes of Reserve Bank, the FMA, these other organisations which have a stake in what money means and are perhaps ambivalent towards innovation?
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess one of the privileges of working with Callaghan Innovation, which is a Crown entity, is that we do get to interact quite frequently with regulators and people that are, obviously the Reserve Bank, but the IRD and other government agencies. And I wouldn't say that they're ambivalent to innovation. I think there's especially a lot of individuals that are actually very pro-innovation, even though collectively you might not get that that impression from some of the organizations themselves. There are definitely some individuals that are assessing these things, seeing where they're going, whether or not they deem them to be money yet is still obviously under debate. But I think there's definitely some smart people there involved with watching the space and assessing it as it grows. So yeah, I think that's one of the things that has kind of spurred us to interact more with other agencies. Is it's not something that we're going to do alone. It collectively needs people to understand the space and move it forward.
How do you broach the difference between, say, fintech, which ultimately is technology and innovation built upon a legacy fiat system, and then the true revolution and the kind of upending of fiat money that you see with something like Bitcoin? Like, how do those two fit together? Because often what I've seen is that the people who understand or are working in fintech, it's almost impossible for them to anticipate or understand a system that threatens the very existence of that structure. I mean, how do you see that? How do you navigate that dichotomy?
Yeah, I think it's open-mindedness, and I guess looking at everything from first principles is, it is really easy, and we see a lot of businesses, a lot of products, a lot of technologies. It's very easy to dismiss something or assume that you know exactly how it functions because you've seen it before, type thing. But the reality is, if you are open-minded and take that approach to looking at everything with fresh eyes, I think there's a lot of things that are challenging in the status quo, and it's I think the payment space is definitely one that I'm interested in, especially looking at what's happening. It's quite exciting to see people tinkering with things like Lightning and seeing what can be built. It sort of reminds me of that, earlier 80s type period where we were, looking at things like FPOS and reinventing our payment systems, etc. And obviously it's slow, but it also feels like more of a groundswell rather than a VC-led charge, if you know what I mean.
Well, what's interesting, actually, reflecting back on my time in Japan and talking to some people there, there's two layers to it. And I mean, literally, there's the base layer of Bitcoin, but then the innovation layer of things like the Lightning Network, which are actually broadly, that my impression was that in Japan, there's a lot more people who are working on that sort of stuff. So you got the likes of the Diamond Hands group and some of those people who are building on Lightning, because that's a space that is open to rapid change and kind of that more of that typical startup approach, whereas the Bitcoin base layer is very much a slow moving, almost ossified at this point, the backbone of the whole thing, and you don't want to be messing around with that too much. And so perhaps, as you say, focus on the payments layer, and we're seeing some of that emerging in New Zealand and globally. Perhaps that's where the kind of the higher speed innovation happens around how can you make a Lightning payment, tap and go, stuff like that, and where that interfaces with legacy fiat as well.
Yeah, and I think those fintechs, those payment businesses are going to start challenging the traditional layers and the payment rails, I guess, more than maybe the retail banks, etc. I mean, that's kind of their space, is to innovate and I guess capture market share and improve the margins and efficiency that exist in the business. So yeah, that's definitely one area where I see it's getting more traction.
Yeah, well, we've just had the FIFA Women's World Cup here in Wellington, and I think, man, how many tourists and visitors have come through and been charged $1 pay wave fees that they don't even know about? That's not a very good look. No. And I'm not sure, but it seems like New Zealand's one of the outliers with that kind of price gouging. I don't know what do you know what it's like overseas with tap and go payments?
Yeah, I don't know comparatively how it sits, but I do know that we're pretty high up there. It's not a good look.
Yeah, and I love this approach because it's very pragmatic. Looking at a real problem. I remember talking to or someone's told me about some of the horror stories around merchant fees in New Zealand, and it can be quite a significant percentage of, especially for hospitality or retail businesses. And that is all being funneled away, and there's not really anything to show for it. So looking at payment, you've seen a few projects in that space come through over your desk?
Yeah, for sure. And I guess, going back to the Lightning Network, it's exciting. When I was over in the US recently for one of the conferences, it was actually the Bitcoin conference, I was able to pay for something over there using that connected back to my node over a Zeus app. And I've got an open channel with Rob, who's had a chat with you in the past, down in Queenstown. So it was quite cool to be in Miami, connected to a node in Wellington with an open payment channel to Queenstown that charged less than a cent New Zealand for its transaction fee, and then I could get something physically handed to me in Miami. So yeah, that sort of stuff kind of puts it in context. But there's beyond Lightning as well. There's other payment initiatives that are happening, and I think it's going to require a multi-pronged approach. There will be some people that require some form of stable coin to get access to the system based on either volatility or just reality of what they need to pay for and closer to a fiat equivalent. So there's some businesses happening that are working on this space to make that more available and ubiquitous in New Zealand.
Yeah, thank you. No, the stable coins are interesting. They sort of the stable coin and then the CBDC is the one that's always brought up, and I know the Reserve Bank are actively looking at that. But what does that mean for New Zealand? I mean, I think I'm certainly eyes open, trying to see where it's heading, but it seems like a bit of a closed project in terms of the CBDC side of it. I mean, have you got any insight or thoughts on where that's going and what the Reserve Bank's looking at with
I think I guess our goal from a Callaghan Innovation perspective is to provide some rigor around, not necessarily directly into projects like CBDCs, but in terms of the access to data scientists and the equivalent, we can do things that will shine a light on the potential good and or bad of things like CBDC. So an example might be a feasibility study, which we're looking to conduct at the moment. And that would go something like, is a anonymous open source quantum resistant CBDC even feasible? And I know there's potentially some oxymorons in there, but the starting point is what does this even mean if, in terms of the design or the structure of something, in terms of the feasibility of what's being discussed. And if we can run independently some form of project or scientific analysis around what we see, hopefully that can be taken into consideration or sit adjunct to any projects that are happening in this space, without necessarily being directly involved in what's going on.
Yeah, I think one of the things from this seat that I see, looking up the road to the Reserve Bank, one of the challenges is that, Bitcoin doesn't, it's got a brand, but it doesn't have a CEO. There's no marketing department except what people choose to talk about and choose to share personally. And in a way, the innovation of the Lightning Network, for example, is extremely decentralized, but also very powerful. And because there's no brand name, there's no company, there's nothing that you can kind of latch onto, is there the possibility that, the Reserve Bank is going to get hoodwinked by the likes of Binance or Ripple or some unregistered security provider to build this thing, which actually needs to be built using open source technology like Bitcoin and Lightning? Who do you talk to when you want to implement Lightning for the New Zealand market at a national level? Like, where do you even start with that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think we're not always, especially from a government lens, in a resourced context, able to do a lot of the things that we will look overseas to a lot of things, right? Mm-hmm. And that's just the nature of being a smaller country at the bottom of the where we are. Yeah. We'll look at Australia. We'll look at what ASIC are doing. We'll look at what Singapore are doing in terms of the MAS, Monetary Authority of Singapore. We'll look at what technologies exist. But I think we're also probably going to get quite a steer from some of the developing nations as well. And so if we see adoption in places like Africa, obviously El Salvador is doing its thing. All eyes on Argentina at the moment in terms of their current presidential potential candidate. There's things that are happening that may force our hand. So maybe we aren't the ones that necessarily shift first or have to be directly influenced internally. These might be influences that come from overseas, but I think being across all of those things, which is part of what my role is as well, is just being aware of all the trends and all the things that are occurring, so that we can kind of factor them in from a New Zealand context.
Yeah, it's really important work. I mean, New Zealand's an interesting place. You know, FPOS, for example, we were quite early to that particular piece of tech. But with many other things, you know, the joke is New Zealand is 10 years late on everything else. And that can almost play out in our favour with these kinds of things, because we can let other countries trailblaze and see what worked, what didn't work. Yet at the same time, there is certainly a first mover advantage in something like money. Time will tell.
And what's the impetus for change, right? Why give up your card that you can swipe if it works type things? I think overseas they've, in places like China with WeChat and things like that, they've shifted based on a specific need. So maybe our need is merchant fees, like we were talking about before. Maybe that's a catalyst to saying, if we can reduce these down to almost zero, that's a reason to jump into something different.
Yeah, well, I mean, speaking of China, my good friend has just come back from China, and I caught up with him yesterday, and he opened up his wallet and showed me his 100 RMB notes, and he said he couldn't even use them. And when I was last in China, I was still able to pay cash, though it was very hard to find money changes, to swap out money for RMB. Everything's WeChat now, and I'm not even sure what that means. Like, if you're visiting, like, how do you even set that up? Like, what does that mean? For society to have that all being run through one single app, and certainly they're facing their own challenges there with that. And I mean, that's one way of looking at it. And then you've got, Japan being the other one, which is still for the most part 90% cash for day-to-day transactions, and these huge black holes of money that are swirling around. It's good to, I guess, have a variety of examples to look at to base decisions on.
Yeah, and just coming back to the Reserve Bank, I mean, to their credit, they've had 6,000 submissions on the cash system in New Zealand, and they've obviously taken that on board to ensure that this is a property or a vehicle that we will retain, because there's people that depend on it, there's communities that depend on it, there's communities that don't have access to a local bank branch, for example, and have to travel on a bus to get access to those sorts of things. So in terms of keeping that as a vehicle, that seems to be well and firmly entrenched at the moment. Whether or not it's the right vehicle for everybody, that should be an option, I think. So yeah, that's at least being kept in the frame in New Zealand versus, I know some other countries, it's losing the battle in terms of relevance or in terms of being a vehicle.
Yeah, no, there is a technologist approach to it, which would say cash is outdated and that sort of thing. But certainly for myself, I stand in solidarity, having been through the Cyclone Gabrielle in Hawke's Bay, where my family is, not being able to use FPOS or anything for a number of days, weeks in some areas. I mean, cash works, and I'm often taken aback in Wellington when you've got cashless venues, because instantly you're excluding many people who are unbanked. And someone told me as many as 20,000 beneficiaries are unbanked, and so they get a family member to receive the money in lieu of them. And those sort of numbers, I think, aren't spoken about. I feel like in the media, we've got a lack of discussion around these topics. I mean, I'm not sure the general public are aware of even some of the machinations of some of the discussions that we're having right now. What's your take around sort of the general public, kind of the educational piece around these discussions and that sort of thing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, maybe before we talk about the general public, I think even ourselves, we sometimes get a little bit of the bias comes in. We get sort of ensconced in our own worlds. It's an echo chamber. You listen to a lot of technologists talking about the next thing. there's some amazing things happening, and we often lose our focus on the broader societal impact of what would happen if these people get excluded if we implemented this. And I think that's a good way to challenge all new technologies, is to say, right, this applies really well in this context. How does it apply, or how would you fit it into these different communities? So if you've got some that are more based on reputation barter systems and things like that, how does this fit with that sort of thing, or does it not fit, and that's okay? So I think general education, it's a hard one. I think we've got processes that a lot of people are happy with and or apathetic about change because it works for them, and it's a hard thing to do. I know this happens as well in the spaces like digital identity. Obviously, things like RealMe we've tried to implement as a collective society, and that I think has last count was something like 500,000 people had adopted RealMe. So those sorts of new technologies, those changes, it's not simple in terms of how you encourage proliferation of those sorts of things, but it's definitely something we need to think about.
And more broadly, obviously you've got a background in Singapore, looking at the fintech and some of the innovation there, and very much that kind of city-state, the unique niche that Singapore exists in enabled a lot of that international banking and that to flourish there. What do you see as the role of innovation technology in New Zealand's future?
I think a lot of it's community-based. So we've engaged quite heavily with some initiatives that are working with small community groups, and some of this is money-based, but a lot of it is actually funding mechanisms. So working with the Wellbeing Protocol, for example, they have worked on a project with Sport NZ, Nukora, Te Aotearoa, on a trial with a group of men called Tanehaura. And the purpose of that was to see if we could get funding into community groups that typically have problems filling out application forms or adhering to the expectations of whoever is dishing out that money. There's often bureaucratic layers involved in certain ways and things like that. So could we use some of these new voting mechanisms to allow communities access to the sorts of things that will help facilitate them, because they know what they sort of need. Obviously it has to go through a process, but putting that on more of a transparent app-based conviction voting type process. So that's one. There's another one that's in the pipelines as well, which isn't public yet, but it's working with communities so that rather than just being off in technology land or innovation for the sake of innovation, it has a tangible output. We can see it working with the people that need it the most, and measure it from there.
Yeah, I think communities are really important, and we saw that again come back to the cyclone, for example, and just how people were able to come together in my part of the world there and kind of get through it. Certainly, though, building resiliency and the economic reality of New Zealand's situation, we're not Singapore, and we're at the bottom of the world. Obviously, there's traditional industry and agriculture and that sort of thing here, but in terms of the future information economy, a hyper-Bitcoinized world, for example, how can New Zealand communities interface with that effectively? Certainly something I'm trying to explore with this podcast. Because, I think there's the bones of a good country here. We're going through a rough period at the moment, but could we be the first to adopt the FPOS of Bitcoin, for example, and really lead the world in that space as a small, nimble country?
Jack Dorsey posted a map of the world flipped upside down the other day and said, why not? Yeah. So we could actually just see ourselves as at the top of the world if we chose to.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of buzzwords out there, and I think there's a lot of trigger words in this space in terms of blockchain, Web3, whatever, Bitcoin maximalists, whatever your take is. I think for me, what I'm seeing is it's decentralized internet technologies for me as the group, and it can be Nostr, it can be whatever technology you're interested in. But I think that opens New Zealand up to connectivity, being integrated into a world that's now pretty hyper connected. We can be very much a part of that decentralized movement, and you don't have to be based in certain places. We constantly get feedback that there are people looking for software developers that high paid jobs, weightless jobs, sustainable jobs. So traditionally in New Zealand we've had tourism and dairy as kind of our drivers, and when you look at an environmental impact, it's challenging for us to scale beyond what we have, or arguably even up to what we have. But when you look at the space of digital, especially decentralized internet technologies, it's weightless, right? It's scalable. It's high paying jobs. I think it's a space we can play in quite well.
Yeah, and I mean, recognizing though, I think that there is a balance there. I mean, certainly I'm adjacent to some agri-tech work, and I appreciate New Zealand does have a unique position to be able to grow things. I mean, dairy aside, high value fruit and export crops. I mean, New Zealand's perfectly situated to do that, and the technology as well that goes into that. It takes a lot of work to grow a kiwi fruit. People don't realize it doesn't just happen on its own, and that kind of feeds into this information economy though, because you've got the actual primary production of these things, but then the IP and the knowledge into how it works, which again in other parts of Callaghan that's being looked at and supported. So I think broadly an innovative approach to information, an innovative approach to innovation is really important. And again, being these islands at the bottom of the world, we need to lean into what we've got here.
Yeah, exactly. Add value to our raw products as well. I think it's kind of something that we need to do more of. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Interesting. You mentioned Nostr. They are having there is a Nostr Asia conference coming up in November in Tokyo, or Tokyo/Hong Kong, which will be interesting to see how a decentralized group centralizes itself into a conference. Yeah. But how do you feel about that? I mean, that's sort of getting away from the money side of Bitcoin, but stuff like Nostr, I mean, is that within the remit of what you're looking at with Callaghan?
Yeah, totally. I mean, in terms of from an innovation technology perspective, it's very much around, what are the latest trends? Where is it going? I mean, it's been interesting to see Nostr from a relay perspective just be able to do what it does. Obviously, it's still small. But you can see things unfolding in the world of Twitter, Instagram, all those sorts of things. There's a lot of talk around governments intervening and things like that in terms of these platforms. So if there is a censorship resistant, or at least a more flexible way of consuming and interacting with social media, then those things are absolutely relevant to where things are headed. So
yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting as well. I mean, looking at the natural attributes, or the attributes, I guess, of a country or a jurisdiction. I mean, Singapore, again, your background there, but I mean, there's certainly some challenges there around human rights and things. Same with China, different parts of the world. There's always there's these trade-offs, right? And it seems like censorship resistance, though not necessarily in the government's best interest, is in the best interest of the people, and actually represents a very attractive it's almost a resource or an attribute of a country to be able to build in the open and not risk that kind of shutdown or closure that we're seeing happen in a lot of places. How would you rate New Zealand's approach to some of those fundamental human rights that we're seeing sort of eroded globally? Yeah,
it's a good question. I remember we had some visitors at some point from the US who were quite concerned about, I think we had the ability that we changed some law at some point around being able to customs being able to seize digital devices and things like that, and they were quite concerned about that. I think we obviously have rules that exist and rules that are enforced, and there's always a fine line between it. So it's I don't know if we're the best in the world at some of these things. I think we often rely on the fact that we're small and so far haven't adopted too firm an approach to enforcing some of these things. But yeah, a lot of that also comes back to our culture versus
take it easy, mate, sort of thing. Yeah. No, I just death for drugs is what they say at the airport in Singapore, and I think, man, what that would mean in the New Zealand context, or just being able to say, look, I don't agree with what the government says. Like in a way that just getting out of the way is enough for innovation to get going in a lot of cases.
Yep.
And so I think keeping, certainly from my perspective, keeping that in mind as things get increasingly frothy globally and politically. But I think, as I said at the beginning, I think the work Callaghan's doing is really powerful, really important. You're based here in Wellington, but is that the Web3 team is mainly here, or?
No, we're pretty much everywhere in New Zealand. We also had somebody in Melbourne previously. So we try and adopt that kind of decentralized approach, which works well. So we're living that. It even allowed me to get away to Japan at the start of the year. So I was over there for a bit, operating normally. Was in a forest of out near Karuizawa, and
nice.
Had 300 meg up and down, so I was still able to operate, and most people thought I was still in Wellington. So, no, but we are decentralized in that sort of context, and then we come together when we need to.
Yeah, you still got a bit of a connection to Japan?
Oh, very much so. Yeah. My wife's Japanese, my kids are half Japanese, obviously. So, yeah, we get back there when we can.
Nice. Yeah, no, it's certainly I've got a special place in my heart, and I'm hoping to get back in November, so I can catch up. There's actually quite an interesting Bitcoin scene there, and yeah, Tokyo. I mean, it's just a creative city. I mean, the rest of Japan's also amazing, but just the sheer scale of it is really mind blowing if you've never seen a mega city before. Though perhaps an endangered species. I mean, as we decentralize, everyone wants to move to the countryside. But hey, Kevin, I appreciate you popping in and having a catch up. Is there anything you want to share in terms of people who are interested in what we're talking about here with Callaghan Innovation, your work? If they want to get in touch or learn more about this, where can they go?
Yeah, so there's a website, web3nz.xyz. And I think that's regardless of what sphere in decentralized internet technologies you find yourselves. We're just encouraging people to come through that as a gateway, even if you're a Bitcoin maxi or whatever philosophy you adopt. Because we're a small nation, there will be sub entities or categories that sort of hopefully feed off that as well. But that is a starting point. We're just trying to encourage as many people to come through, and then from there, we're trying to disseminate information around the regulatory situation in New Zealand, the legal scene, taxation, like all the things that businesses need to know about in order to build good businesses here. And often that's quite expensive in terms of the advice. So the idea is if we can democratize access to that information, we can encourage more innovation, more businesses. So definitely that is a starting point. There's a community there. And any questions and things like that people have, hopefully we can get people in front of experts as well that will help distribute that information.
Well, I must admit, you had Lisa from Base 58 on recently, who did a masterclass on the Lightning Network, and I was blown away with how well put together that was. It was a very well done presentation, and I think you did really well to get her, to talk to the group and organize that masterclass.
I bumped into her at it was a TBD event in Miami as well.
Yeah,
she just walked up and said, "Hey, what do you do?" And I said, "I work for New Zealand government." And she said, "I'm a Lightning developer," and we set it all up. So, and that was in a collaboration with AUT as well. So we actually had a whole university class, computer science class there, listening to her as well. So that was really good. Yeah,
no, thank you for that. It was really awesome, and to have that kind of caliber resource, facilitated, and certainly I know myself and many others got a lot of value out of that. So it's great stuff, Kevin. Really appreciate it, and let's keep in touch.
Absolutely. Thanks, Cody. Cheers.
Thank you for listening. I do hope you enjoyed the show. I am Cody Allingham, and that was The Transformation of Value. If you'd like to get in touch, please send me an email at hello@thetransformationofvalue.com, and I will get back to you.